in the cashew producing areas. And as you just realized, we have started the recording. During the Q&A session, we will take off the recording so that you can raise your hand, and then we invite you in to ask a question. Again, let me also mention that it is being presented to you in English, but there is also simultaneous translation, and you can choose the language of your choice using the button below on your screen. Let me also mention that we are working on the ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo in Benin. Registration is ongoing, and we invite you all to register quickly so that you take advantage of the early bird advantage. Again, let me also say that today Jim will be hosting two of our experts in the industry, and here we're talking about Amit Pai and Jean Rao, who will be sharing the perspectives from the different locations they are operating in. At this point, let me acknowledge the partners and sponsors who have made this possible for us. And this is the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, GIZ Move, Tom Cashew, USAID, Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and the Cashew Information. The session today is, as I said earlier, I'm going to focus on markets and crops. But then before we even invite Jim Fitzpatrick, the biggest talking point in the past week has been the temporary ban on exports in Côte d'Ivoire. And I think this is an issue that we will have to address in the coming weeks and months, and to see whether really we are on the right track. So at this point, I will want to invite Jim Fitzpatrick. I've seen his video already showing. And then, hi, Jim.
Morning, Ernest. How are you?
I'm fine, yeah. How are you doing, Jim?
Yeah, all good. Thanks very much indeed. Enjoying these interesting times.
Yeah, Jim, just to mention that we have also started the publication of the ACA's Africa Cashew Splits, and this is going to be available to the cashew world Monday mornings. So every Monday morning, you wake up, and then the splits are there explaining to you some of the happenings across the globe on the cashew front, and again in each country, what exactly the dynamics are. And I think, Jim, it's a good idea to have this kind of document available to our cashew participants and actors so that they can have a lot of information. Again, it's more towards better informed cashew industry because we have a lot of rumors and we want to dispel all the rumors. Your thoughts on this, Jim?
I saw it on Monday. I was really pleased to see it back. Well done to your team, Ernest. I think it is the only real independent African cashew publication, and long may it continue.
Yeah, and indeed it is going to continue so that we have the possibility to provide a lot of information out there. But Jim, I did mention the issue of the talking point, the big talking point in the past week, the policy on export bans. Are we taking it too far as a continent?
Well, are we taking it too far? Let's see the impact of it before we make a judgment on that. I'm going to talk about it today pretty extensively.
So then on this note, I'll leave you with the audience, and please enjoy the session today.
Welcome, everyone. Good to be with you again. Thanks very much for joining us. We're going to talk today about markets and production. We're going to talk to our guests. Ernest has briefly introduced them, John Rao and Amit Pai, on production mainly in their two specialist regions. And we'll finish up with a discussion on supply and demand. Your questions, as always, are most welcome, most appreciated. And we're looking forward to talking to you, getting some input from your side too during these events. Our guests, John Rao is a long-term, highly engaged, really interesting guy to talk to is John. I had a long conversation with him last year during the conference, and he knows his stuff. And that's why we've invited him on today to talk about production and developments in the Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, the Gambia, that region, which is now, of course, harvesting. Also, a really good guy to talk to about cashews is Amit Pai, the managing partner of Amit Agro. Bit of a cashew veteran, knows India, is a thoughtful man about this sector. We've had both of these guests on the GME before, and they've never let us down. So look forward to talking to them a little bit later. I'm going to come to the two of them in the middle of the session when we'll talk about production in the two regions I've mentioned. Could we, administrators, could we promote our two guests to panelists, if you wouldn't mind? Get back to these two experts later. Before that, let me remind you that the GME and its recordings and a lot of other interesting content from the African Cashew Alliance is available on the YouTube channel. All 67 of these webinars, if you have the patience for that, you've more than I have, but all 67 of them are available up there, and sometimes you can dip in and get a feeling of how the industry has developed over the last 3 years. What are we going to talk about today? Well, I promised markets, and we're going to start on markets. And today we're going to break it up into different sections. We're going to start with the first section, which is about current developments and price. We're going to talk about what's happening in Côte d'Ivoire. We're going to talk about what's happening in Vietnam. And we're going to talk about production with our guests. And finally, we'll have a look at what all of that means for the supply and demand scenario going forward. You know me, I like my numbers, I like the fundamentals, but we can't start there, not in this market. We need to start, and I've just termed it buy on rumor, sell on fact. That's an old adage for traders, which means that essentially you buy when there's rumors of news coming out, positive news in the stock market where this came from. And then when the news comes out, you sell. Why do you sell? You sell because probably everyone else has been buying on the rumor too. Well, that might sound familiar. Let's have a look at some of the trends in the market and some of our indicators. Generally speaking, and I'm focusing more or less on West Africa because that's the most topical region at this moment, farm gate prices are steady. They're not really taking off as you might expect when you look at kernels or RCN internationally. Crop definitely looks a little bit lower this year than last year's bumper crop. And we've got some calculations I'll share with you later. We think it's between 7 and 15% down. What does that mean is the real question. International RCN, you probably know well by now that this market has moved up anywhere from $100 a ton to $300 a ton, depending on what, for when and where. And unfortunately, the series of contract defaults and price negotiations, which is the same thing, by the way, a renegotiation is a default, that's kicked off again, and that's causing a lot of difficulty. It's causing panic in some areas, and it's certainly causing a lot of dialogue and even further volatility. Looking at kernels, certainly offered prices have moved up. Buyers are reluctant to follow. I've heard a few stories of remarkably high prices, but in general, I think this market has moved to levels at which now buyers are beginning to wonder whether or not they should make any more decisions. The prospect of defaults, delays of shipment perhaps, could change that. It could force buyers' hands, and we could see some further volatility as a result. Meantime, if we look downstream and we think about demand, so right now demand still looks strong. I base that on shipments. I base that on offtake from warehouses. But we don't immediately see the impact of higher prices on demand. That takes time because of the nature of the business. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. The second half of 2024 could be a much different scenario. A market cannot move up by these kind of numbers without some impact on demand. And I wrote recently in a report, nobody actually needs cashew nuts. So we need to be careful in the way we look at our markets and the way we consider the prospects for demand in the second half of the year. Remember 2022, it's not that long ago, demand in Western countries collapsed for different reasons. It was about the economy, it was about Russia's attack on Ukraine, it was about inflation, but it did happen. And we need to carefully look at what might happen in the second half of this year in response to current developments. Let's remind ourselves, before we go any further, of things we talked about 2 weeks ago on the last session. I don't normally do this, but I want to do it today because I want to remind all of us of where we were 2 weeks ago and what was going on at that time, and especially some of the numbers that we talked about. So looking back 2 weeks, we talked about a very strong trade in raw cashew nuts. We talked about strong Vietnamese imports, 1 million tons broken by mid-May. That remarkable figure hasn't been done before, except in 2021, and let's face it, nobody really knows what happened in 2021. In India, strong imports, the biggest April numbers for 10 years, and imports strongly up versus 2023 and indeed versus 2022. We looked at the supply and demand balance in Vietnam and the balance of inventory for processing, and we saw that it calculated at that time around about 70, 75 days. So 2 months plus a few days, which is about normal. It wasn't overstocked, it wasn't understocked. It was thereabouts, about normal at that time. We also had a good look at demand, and we looked at, if you will recall, the different regions and how far shipments using Vietnamese exports as the key metric, how far those exports at that moment, that was the 15th of May figures, were ahead of the previous year. We looked at cashew kernels pricing and costings over the whole range of prices, from the lowest prices in Vietnam to the highest prices in the Indian domestic market, and we compared them to each other. And we looked at RCN prices and the relationship between RCN prices and kernels prices, which some people call the parity. And at that time we found that, it was coming back into line. That RCN kernels relationship was coming back into a place where parity, for me at least, means that you could buy raw cashew nuts today, do your calculations, and sell them today, and on paper you've made a profit. And at that time it was coming into balance. I wonder, where is it now? So what have we seen in the last 2 weeks that really makes us need to focus, makes us need to question market reports, and makes us need to question the information that's available on cashews? Ernest mentioned Splits. So Splits is African but independent. It's pro-African but neutral in terms of market information. But not everyone is, and a lot of the information in our market is distorted. And over the last 2 to 3 weeks, what's taken over is rumor. Rumor, myth, misunderstanding, lack of information. And into the vacuum thus created flows volatility. Why is that? I just jotted down a few aspects why we get this phenomenon in our markets. First couple of things are just facts. We have very few multinationals. Often multinationals are the organizations that provide information and provide the context for others to understand the market. Secondly, we don't have exchange traded commodities. And in my opinion, nor should we. But the fact that they don't exist means that we don't have independent market information flowing into the market. Our supply chain is not integrated. What does that mean? That means that people don't talk to each other directly. There's no, or a lack of, first-hand communication. So a processor in India or Vietnam never talks to a farmer association in Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire or Guinea-Bissau. And therefore the information is interpreted through other channels. There is a history of inequality in relationships in the cashew business. And that's related to the lack of an integrated change. We have volatile trading conditions. We have a business culture that for as long as I can remember, and unfortunately I can remember quite a long way back, a business culture that encourages speculation. And there's an element of that going on right now. And if we think back a few years to 2017, we saw a huge expression of this. Speculation became more important than doing business, with repercussions for many people that they still haven't recovered from. We also have, and increasingly in West Africa, we have government policy made without understanding of markets and sometimes without information about markets. So the basis of that policy is difficult to understand. We have a history of cashews being used as a vehicle for moving money. That goes back 50 years. In a way, you see it now. You see cross-border trade in West African countries particularly. You see governments trying to clamp down on that, like on the border between Guinea-Bissau and Senegal right now, or on the border between Benin and Togo. We see publications that often rely on actors for information. Now, there's nothing wrong with relying on actors for information, but do we always appreciate that reporters have an interest themselves? That's one of the reasons this particular event was started, so that we could have something that wasn't dictated by individual actors, individual motivations. And of course, we have to pick our guests very carefully to get people who look at the market neutrally. And finally, and not surprisingly, everyone, and I mean everyone, in this business talks their book. And that's an issue. Again, to be expected. But is it always identified that someone is talking their book? If you know they're talking their book, that's fine. You can understand, you can interpret, you can get to the bottom of the rumors. But if you don't understand that, you're listening to something presented as fact that is actually opinion. What does this mean for the market? And how does it change market sentiment? And I think this is important because this defines a lot of what's been spoken and what's happened over the last 2 weeks. Firstly, it creates fear, it creates uncertainty, and in some cases, desperation. And that leads to stress for individual decision makers and in the market. It feels typically like there's never enough time. Contract risk increases. Logistical risk increases and supply chains get longer. Then you tend to get governments intervening, and bear in mind I mentioned that their information is often poor. And finally, in this context, you get speculation. So it starts with fear and it ends with greed. And that is a situation that is dangerous for the long-term future of the industry and something which needs to be addressed. And that's part of the reason that we have this event, to try and bring some information. Let me give you some examples of information. These are just picked at random. There are hundreds of examples of poor information or misunderstanding in recent weeks. Here's a few of them. One was a report from Senegal that the crop was set to reach 160,000 tons. This is from last year. An 84% increase in the crop. Well, that doesn't happen very often. But in actual fact, the figure was just wrong. Someone had misunderstood that the raw cashew nuts coming into Senegal were actually grown in Guinea-Bissau. Simple thing, read the headline, you can misunderstand completely. If you read it was 160,000 tons in 2023 and someone told you it was 60,000 tons in 2024, you might mistakenly conclude that there was a crop problem in Senegal. And that's why getting the information is right. Here's another one. This recently published, only on the 20th of May, it looks like the headline, cashew production, again in Benin, is up 9%. 2023-2024 crop. But of course, it refers to last year. But the timing and the headline and some of the text in it really was confusing. You could easily have misinterpreted that as saying that the crop was up 9%. Another one from publications, a couple of things. The raw cashew nut market is going up crazily every week. Well, I'd like to know what crazily means. I mean, in terms of market analysis, crazily is not a term that really describes anything. How crazy is it? Because at that moment, raw cashew nut prices were at levels that they had been at in 2021, 2019, and any time from 2015 through to 2018. So what's crazy about something going back to where it was previously? Processors in Vietnam are facing a shortage of raw materials. Another statement, but we know, as we saw last time, and I just mentioned to you, that there's 1 million tons imported by the 15th of May. So there couldn't be a shortage of raw materials. What there could be is later some problem. But it's not fact, but it's presented as facts. These kind of things cause us to get in situations where markets are confusing. Information is not real information, it's rumor and it's myth. So let's talk about it, and we'll try and talk about some actual fact and some information. So prices, processing and trade. Let's have a look at kernels prices. So there has been obviously a big price reaction on cashew kernels to the demand and rumor. I actually couldn't tell you the price of 320s today. I can tell you where it was last week, but in the last couple of days there have been some really incredibly high and confusing reports in the marketplace. Are these prices general? Are they a good guide to the market? Certainly not. I think that we can really talk in this range, 305, maybe up to 320 even. That's probably where the market is. Can you find someone to sell at those prices today? Probably not. Probably very few people are going to sell in this current environment. But as of Monday, the market had risen by 27% in a few weeks. But in actual fact, it's only gone back to levels that it was at in 2022, back in May 2022. So what we're talking about is this dip has been eliminated. The low price period has very quickly reversed. And let's look at some of the factors that influenced over this period. We're looking at May 2019 through to the very end of May and beginning of June 2024. So if we look back over the period, we see a dip in price due to COVID. Demand dropped, particularly in markets that were badly hit by lockdown, so India and China particularly. Later, we saw in 2021, or from May, probably from April, May 2021, a dip in price as the impact of a very large crop in Cambodia hit the market. 2022, and we're looking at the negatives right now. I'm going to come back to the positives in a moment. 2022 second half, we saw demand crash after Russia attacked Ukraine. We saw inflation rise in the West. Americans, and to a lesser extent Europeans, reduced their consumption, reduced their imports of cashew kernels, and we saw the price go down. Now, looking at the positive side, because we've explained dips in price in 2020, dips in price in 2021 and in 2022. But of course, it's not so long ago, back in 2021, that we had quite an interesting price spike, probably above today's levels. And that was based on strong demand. So over these periods, we've had periods of essentially shocks in the market, COVID, large Cambodian crop, unexpected, at least in its volume and certainly in the reports that were made about it. And then we've had basically the legs kicked out from underneath Western demand in the second half of 2022. We've also had periods of positive demand reaction during COVID and strong demand during 2023 in response to low prices. So 2023 prices started reasonably, fell sharply, and we've only seen that reversed in the last 3 or 4 weeks. So I suppose the first observation we should make is that why have prices moved up so sharply? And the first thing is because they were too low. Forget about the crop, forget about demand, forget about everything else. Prices just simply had got too low, and this was not sustainable. It was always going to happen. Probably the big surprise is that it's happened in such a panic-stricken and such a volatile way so quickly. Part of the reason for that is that we've had a lot of forward contracting, and who wouldn't buy if you could buy at some of these low prices? Maybe no one was ever buying forward 320s at $2.40, but they were probably buying them at $2.50, which looks like a remarkably low price today. And this situation, and this needs to be always considered, that forward contracting on kernels without any significant volume forward contracting on raw cashew nuts means that export processors tend to start each season with sales and no purchases. So in trading language, they tend to start each season with a short position. And that, of course, changes the way people react, because you're not in a situation where you're trying to judge if I can resell these products that I'm buying today at a higher price. You're in a situation where you're saying, I've already sold them. How can I ensure I'm going to make a profit? How can I meet my budget? How can I make sure that I don't make a significant loss? And that means people think differently. Looking at raw cashew nuts, again, we've seen this remarkable rise in prices over recent weeks. So this latest price is Monday's price. It's pretty remarkable. Let's just plug in when the ban came in there. So if we just plug in the ban on around about the 7th of May, you can see that the market had already risen. It had risen to levels that we'd seen early in 2023, but because of essentially the surplus position, the market fell in the later part of 2023 for raw cashew nuts. It's actually started too high and then dipped down. Now this is based on offered prices. So offered prices are the most responsive prices in the market, because we can't always be sure. We hear of trades, but we can't always be sure of the volume that was associated to them. So we use offered prices. So prices returned to 2023 levels by the time of this export ban, and then we got this reaction to the ban. And prices quickly moved up to levels, but again, I mean, sustainable levels. We're back looking at 2022 levels that reflected cashew kernels prices. Now, remember, I mentioned first half 2022 was very good, very strong demand, second half not so good. RCN prices fell once it was realized demand was not so good. Prior to this, so this first step up was based on rumors of crop problems. Initially, rumors of a crop problem in Cambodia, which has apparently proved to be unfounded. And latterly, rumors of crop problems in West Africa, where really the rumors definitely exaggerated the situation, but it was more exaggerated in some places than others. And now we get this ban. And really, what the ban has done is, in my opinion, illogically, this is an overreaction in my opinion, but it has pushed prices beyond levels that we've seen in recent years. And the chart doesn't show one thing. The chart doesn't show that the quality of raw cashew nuts this year, in general, there are exceptions. Guinea-Bissau, for example, maybe one. John will tell us later. But there are areas where we're looking at much lower quality. Côte d'Ivoire, for example. And higher price, lower quality actually means that the comparison is a little bit skewed. So again, we're looking at higher prices. Now, we've looked at kernels prices and we've looked at RCN prices. Let's just look at the impact on costs for processors. So I do my calculation taking the benchmark RCN grades. So for Vietnam, I've used Côte d'Ivoire quoted prices. For India, I've used Guinea-Bissau quoted prices. And for domestic Côte d'Ivoire, obviously I've used Côte d'Ivoire farm gate. So we look at this and we see that a calculated cost based on £45 is way too close for comfort in terms of pricing. So in order to make just a 15% gross margin, processors would need to be selling their 320s at 340 and all their other grades at prices that relate to that 340. In India, to make a 15% gross margin, processors would need to be selling probably somewhere near to $3.75, probably more than that in fact. And neither of those are possible just now. The other aspect is it's very difficult to buy the raw cashew nuts to allow you to sell at those prices at the moment. So processors are pretty much back to where they were. So we went from a period when there was very little parity, as I called it, very little opportunity to buy and sell without risk taking, without speculation. We went through a very short period where the prices started to come in line, and now we're back in a period where, again, they're out of line. And what happens when they're out of line? Well, something has to change. What can change? Well, kernels can go up, RCN can go down. That doesn't mean they both move, they both can move, but the relationship has to be re-established in some way, or people will eventually stop processing. It's different in West Africa. Now, if we take Côte d'Ivoire and we take farm gate prices, so this is based on farm gate prices, both of the other two are based on imported custom freight prices. Take farm gate prices, and this would look like Ivorian processors selling in the export market could do very well, buying today and selling today. Of course, most of them will have already committed large volumes of their production for sale earlier and therefore at lower prices. The problem, of course, is there simply isn't enough processing capacity in Côte d'Ivoire or indeed anywhere else in West Africa to serve demand based on this calculation. So there's an opportunity for some efficient processors to make money, but there's not enough capacity to process the crop. Looking at this, again, we say something has to change. The question is, what will it be? Are these raw cashew nut prices sustainable? Do kernels have to move up? Or is the whole thing just overdone at the moment and we need a correction? Those would be the main questions arising from this kernels parity calculation. So let's have a look at Côte d'Ivoire. And I want to try and introduce a bit better understanding of how the market works in Côte d'Ivoire and what happens there, as well as what's going on right now in Côte d'Ivoire. In other words, to put some context in the current developments. So first of all, let's try to understand what happens. So as we know, the country is the largest producer of cashew nuts in the world. Crop last year, 1.25 million tons at least, probably a little bit more than that. And this is when it tends to arrive. So you get February, March, first half April, and then big volumes second half of April into May and into June and even July and August. So the crop can go on a long time. This is based on 2023, and this is based on feedback from processors. So the crop is actually spread out over a long period of time. Now, it may be later in 2024 because it did start a little bit later. But it's a big crop, it's a big country, and we need to understand that the crop comes in over a long period. Unfortunately, even in a normal year, the outturn yield tends to decline as the year goes on. And that's for not a lot of reasons, not least is the lack of any real on-farm or local infrastructure to dry and store the nuts. That's the first thing. Secondly, processing. So what is the processing capacity in the country? Well, if we look, and this was some work undertaken in February of this year, I was lucky enough to do a survey of many factories, and we talked to a lot of people, and we gathered a lot of information to try and get an idea of where the capacity is. So at that moment, the installed capacity is basically what the guy who sold you the machines tells you they can do. That's what we're going to call installed capacity. Around about 470,000 tons at that moment. No factory reaches 100% of its installed capacity in cashews. So we use 85%, which would bring us back to about 365,000 tons. In 2022, what was processed? Only 265,000 tons. Now there is a lot of projects, mainly based on foreign direct investment. And in those projects, there's an additional capacity of about 221,000 tons. And there may even be furthers to add in the meantime. So that might be, it could be up to as much as 300,000. If you take the whole thing, add what's realistically there at the moment, add the projects, the capacity, sometime in, I think it's 2028, because factories take a long time to reach their capacity. The capacity could reach about 600,000 tons. That's maybe, I think 2028 at the earliest. Others might tell you it'll happen more quickly. And that's based on all those projects happening. All those projects working, all the money coming forward, all the businesses and entrepreneurs and investors deciding to go ahead. That'll be about half the crop. Maybe a little bit less than half because the crop has been increasing every year. So let's have a look at what happens with product in Côte d'Ivoire. This is again 2023. And I've taken a crop figure of 1.25 million because that's the nearest I can get to reconciling trade figures and crop figures. The government of Côte d'Ivoire tells us that 849,250 tons were exported, about 68% of the production. That would mean, based on the kernels, and we work this back from kernels and talking to processors, about 21% of the crop was processed. There's also significant trade cross-border into Guinea, into Burkina, into Ghana for export, bypassing some of the export restrictions and taxes. There was a carry-out. Some of that is kernels, some of it was raw cashew nut. There is a bit of an issue here. We need to understand that 849,000 tonnes of export plus 60 of informal export brings us somewhere just above 900,000 tonnes. But between them, Vietnam and India imported in 2023 just over 1 million tonnes. So there is something of a shortfall. Now that could be transit stock in Vietnam. It could be that the cross-border trade was a little bit higher. Some of it could be from 2022 crop that was afloat, exported in 2022 but imported in 2023. We don't know. But the difference could be, and if someone said to me, you're wrong by 10%, I'd have a good discussion with them on that. Let's have a look at processing. So in the country, the capacity calculated based on input from processors, about 365,000 tonnes of raw cashew nuts. There were 44 factories, that might be 45 now. Of those, there were 27 that were operational, 17 that were closed, and they varied from old small factories to modern quite good factories. 9 factories that were operational were really struggling, about a third of the factories, and then we had the projects that I've mentioned. So how does that work with the national target for 50% of processing by 2025? Well, it doesn't, obviously. When you've processed 21% in 2023, the chances of processing 50% 2 seasons later are slim. So you've got to look at why. First thing, it's obvious, 21%. First question is 265,000 tonnes processed, 365,000 tonnes capacity. Why are factories not processing to their capacity? And that's based on 85%. It means that the average might be below 85%. That's a question. Second factor is the number of factories that are closed. Why are they closed? Should they be operating? Could they be operating? How modern are they? How much trouble have they got? And finally, focusing in how many factories are actually really struggling. Why are they not reaching their capacity? Why are they not making money? Despite the fact that they are supported by subsidies. Some factories are not operational and not making money. How does that happen? And why does that happen? And naturally, you would expect that the government, so committed to the cashew sector, would take an interest in that. So one of the things they've done is they've suspended export of raw cashew nuts. And that came in on the 7th of May as a temporary measure. Why? To support processors to buy raw cashew nuts, especially processors that are described as national processors, which I'm not quite sure what that means, but I think it means factories that are Ivorian owned and not part of multinational groups or don't have international investors. The ban came in on the 7th of May. Goods in the port were permitted to be exported, goods that had already been committed for export, but buying, and the essence of the ban was buying for export was suspended. More recently, following a meeting with processors, exporters have been told to sell 20% of their stocks to processors. Now, there's been a lot of rumor around about this, but as I understand it, they have been instructed to sell 20% of their stocks in warehouses or in the ports to processors at a price of CFA 455, ex-warehouse, or $750. To my knowledge, there is no differential in the price whether the product is £48 or £44. There is no compensation for the location of the product, so it would have to be moved from the warehouse to the processor's plant. Meantime, the harvest continues. Farm gate prices are relatively steady, though on the lower end, and the quality, for certain, as the harvest continues, the quality that's coming in is lower. Now, it would normally at this time of year start to decline anyway. But this year, I think it's fair to say that in general, the quality of the crop has been lower. So let's have a look at the impact of these events and the impact of the export suspension. First of all, why are the processors supported to buy raw cashew nuts? Well, I think one of the first things is that they simply didn't get their act together. They didn't enter the market in time. Some of these people cited high levels of competition and unfair competition from processors abroad, Asian processors, mostly in India and Vietnam. But having said that, farm gate prices were relatively low. In fact, it's interesting to note that the price that they're expected to pay at $4.55 is higher than the price that they would have been able to buy at the farm gate at any time this season so far, and even today. Second reason, they simply haven't developed their supply chain. And this is common not only for those factories, but for many, many factories in the country. A failure to develop a supply chain connection to farmers makes business difficult. Thirdly, they're poorly financed. Access to working capital for a variety of reasons is difficult. They have some political influence. That's how they can make their case. And I think possibly we should also remember that the processing goal, 50% by 2025, is prioritized above all other goals in the country. So does this mean that there's a major shortage in the country? Was this ban motivated by a shortage of raw cashew nuts? Certainly not. The harvest continues. Is the sale of the raw cashew nuts ex-warehouse at 455 CFA per kilo, about $750, is it profitable for exporters? Well, yes, it should be, based on prices they may have been able to buy from farmers earlier in the year. It should be. And when can we expect the ban to end? Well, the ban can end when CCA, the regulatory body, believes that processors have bought either enough or what they're likely to be able to buy. Then they can decide to end it. There's going to be a period, I would suggest 10 to 15 days maybe, that would tell us, and this is not fact now, this is what looks most likely, but it would suggest that the ban will end sometime in the middle of June. So this is a policy that's reactive to representations from a group of processors, mainly those struggling processors that I mentioned earlier, and it has had certain unintended consequences for the industry, nationally and internationally, and of course it's had consequences for farmers too. Let's have a look at some of those. So first of all, the impact at the moment is major default of contract. There's a lot of renegotiation for afloat goods, goods that were sold, contracted, exported on the water, prices being renegotiated, contracts being defaulted. This, of course, is causing a major loss of reputation for the Ivorian cashew sector in Vietnam. Probably in India too, but it's Vietnam that's doing the most talking about it because that's where most of the Ivorian product goes. Farm gate prices remain in the range of the minimum pricing level in the country, but actually quite low compared to other countries in the region. And the fact is that even if every factory in the country processed according to the capacity that we've spoken about, there would still be about 700,000 tons to export this year. Now I'm not saying that's all still in the country, a lot of it is gone, but that would be the number if we took the crop, the process, and what's left to export. And these factors have already happened. What could happen? Well, potentially we could see a situation where the raw cashew nut quality will decline even further due to the slowness of offtake, the slowness of buying, the lack of buying for export, and of course combine that with a lack of infrastructure to dry and store, and you have a further quality problem. The season is already a low quality season. This will exacerbate the situation. It could be that buyers, raw cashew nut buyers, will simply do their business everywhere else first before coming back to Côte d'Ivoire. Simply because they feel they stand on better ground in other countries with what's available. Raw cashew nut prices probably will fall internationally when the ban is lifted, because the market is so overreacted to this ban that take it away, there's a good chance they'll overreact on the other way. You might see farm gate prices spike up again when the ban is lifted, because there should be some buying going on once that's started. There may be a longer term impact, and that is that when we get to next year, and if we have a good crop next year, if we have a normal crop next year, we're probably looking again at significant surplus production in the world, and that will probably continue for another 3 to 4 years, in my view. Buyers will be reluctant. Buyers will not come to Côte d'Ivoire because they will be looking at it and they will be saying, we're going to buy this, there'll be an export ban, we will not get the material we bought, and we'll be left struggling, scurrying to find material elsewhere in May or June of 2025. There is reaction in Vietnam. You can see it now in the media. You can see it from Vinacas. You can see this kind of headline. And this seems to me that it's part of a campaign. Processing plants face shortage as African suppliers default. Now, I don't know how many African suppliers in other countries are defaulting. I don't know how many Ivorian suppliers are defaulting, but I do know there are defaults. And this is in the news media. You can find this online. This is not doing any good to the reputation. It's not doing any good to the long-term reputation. It's not doing any good to the short-term reputation. But I also think that, in a way, that processors in Vietnam, particularly, possibly in India too, they've really fallen into the trap of overreacting to rumors and maybe a misunderstanding or a lack of information. You know, the idea that there's a temporary export ban and that could become permanent is just not a workable idea. You can see the volumes that Côte d'Ivoire has to sell. The government has never said it was a permanent ban. It was very clear from the beginning. It was a suspension. It was temporary. In fact, their communication around this has not been too bad. What has been poor is getting that communication internationally. So I do think that, in a way, processors and maybe some traders have fallen into the trap of overreacting to the rumors and the misunderstanding. And I think that raw cashew nut prices, and perhaps kernels too, have been forced up to unsustainable levels as a result. Let's have a look at the impact. We'll have a look at the impact of this in Vietnam, and we'll have a look at what I'm calling bubble trouble. And that means that the market spiked up beyond where it should be. There's a little bit of a price bubble, and you know what happens to bubbles, don't you? They burst. Let's have a look at Vietnam. So we go back to mid-May. They're the latest figures that we have. Imports up 15%, production maybe down in the country, 60 to 80,000 tons down, people tell me. Is it possible that brokers reporting that Vietnam is running out of raw cashew nuts? Is that possible right now? Is that possible by the end of the May, based on the numbers we had at that time? Well, it is difficult to see how that could be the case. If you take the carry-in stock, if you take the imports, if you take the crop, it's quite difficult to see how there could be a physical shortage now, accepting, yes, of course, that exports are at tremendously high levels. So it is difficult to see how there could be a physical shortage. There might be a shortage emerging later. due to the interruption to shipments from Ivory Coast. So let's have a quick look at that. Here's a chart for you that's Vietnam's imports from Cote d'Ivoire for raw cashew nuts, 2022 in blue, 2023 in orange, 2024 in grey. And just look at the trend line over the period. So this shows that the middle of the year, July, August, into September, this is when you get peak imports. Now, it was a little bit different in 2022. It actually peaked earlier, which is interesting because the crop was actually a little bit later in 2022. That shows maybe the buyers were reacting a little bit more. But there was another factor, and that was there was a big transit stocks. Let's have another look at this, and let's look early in the year. So we see that the grey bars, 2024 imports, early season imports, much lower. So this just is an indicator of a lower late crop and a low carryout from the previous year. We saw a calculated carryout of about 40,000 tonnes, including kernel stock. So when does Cote d'Ivoire import hit Vietnam? So these shipments that were made March, April, May, so in May it was up to the 7th freely, and after the 7th stocks in the port, people tell me it's about 280,000 tonnes. So they will start to hit May, June, July. Export ban hit this position. That means that the impact of the export ban is felt on raw cashew nuts in the second half of July. So nuts that would be expected to arrive and be processed second half of July and August, that's actually when physically the ban really impacts. And that would mean August onward kernel shipments. So that's the actual impact. That's the fact that we're dealing with. But if we look at the market sentiment and the rumor, we hear Vietnam is running out of cashew kernel, of cashew for processing raw cashew nuts. It's an interesting one because, I mean, both are right, of course. It's just when you look at it, you feel the timing's a bit different. I think the gap here is about 150,000 tonnes. That's material that would have been shipped, should have been shipped, but wasn't. Will it be shipped? Yeah, probably it will. But in the meantime, we're getting this problem of the offering of a float cargo for resale. So if it's a float, it's been sold. There is a contract somewhere. But if it's been resold, someone else is not going to get it, or it's going to be renegotiated. So either the original buyer gets it at a higher price, or it's resold to someone else. Now, how that works on arrival, I'm not sure. If you've got a bill of lading consigned to processor A, can you change that to processor B in Vietnam? I do not know. My understanding is that it's not possible without the agreement of the consignee. So let's see how that works out. Some may be, of course, consigned to trading companies, some may be consigned to order, but there is more to follow on this. And I think that we're quite likely to see some retaliation from buyers in India and Vietnam who have been defaulted on. And as we said, we're already seeing some appeals, some interest to engage governments in trying to correct this situation. What about elsewhere? When does Vietnam usually receive imports from African countries? So I picked three. I put Tanzania in just because it is significant in the first quarter, but really we're looking at Cote d'Ivoire in orange, Nigeria in green, and Ghana in yellow. And in 2023, this is when it happened. We've seen Cote d'Ivoire peaks there. We've seen Nigeria is a little bit earlier, and we've seen that Ghana is a little bit earlier still. So this year, Ghana, the yellow ship, we're estimating about 100,000 tonnes that arrives May and June. Nigeria, about 200,000 tonnes that arrives May and June. Are these numbers any bigger than last year? Not really. They look about the same. Ghana might even be a little bit less. And we look at Cote d'Ivoire. Where does that fit in? Ivorian raw cashew nuts. And I'm talking about 300,000 tonnes shipped prior to the ban. We're looking at arrivals in May and June, which would take up the bulk of those shipments. And then the gap appears in July and August. So it's a much longer season than sometimes people realize. If you look out in December of 2023, cargo was being imported. Now, it could be imported through transit warehouses, so it could have been there some time. I believe that's not happening any longer. But it is quite a long season. And there may be, this year, obviously this is going to be skewed a little bit later. So perhaps the September and October figures will be higher and the July and August figures will be lower. So there's a time issue here, provided, of course, the ban is lifted sometime in June, as we're predicting. Let's have a look at Vietnam's imports. So Vietnam relies on Cote d'Ivoire for about 32% of its raw cashew nuts in 2023. Ghana was 9%, Nigeria was 10%. Nigerian exports go primarily to Vietnam, particularly let's say the ordinary FAQ quality, as we used to call it. And from Ghana, native production from Ghana, which is higher cost, higher quality, tends to go to India. And the transit material, which comes in from Ivory Coast, comes in from Burkina and elsewhere, that tends mainly to go to Vietnam based on its prices. So we almost certainly have a situation where a gap arises in the supply of raw cashew nuts in the middle of the year. Now, there may be more product to come from Nigeria, for example, because of a good crop, but we'll have a look at that when we come to production. So looking at this situation, what's happened? We've seen a delay, we've seen a lot of rumor, we've seen a lot of myth, and we've got a kind of what I'm going to call a chain reaction. Let's have a look at this. We started the year low prices and strong demand. Kernels 320s, 240, demand last year record levels. There are a lot of low price forward contracts. The market had been low priced for some time, and obviously all forward contracts now are below the market price, but even at that moment they were significantly low price contracts. Even from top processors, they may not have been these very low levels, but they were still low priced contracts on kernels. So we end up in a situation where there is a certain amount of jeopardy going into the year. Good demand, low prices, high forward contracting. Crop concerns emerged actually throughout last year. I remember talking at the African Cashew Alliance conference last September about concerns with regard to the impact of El Nino. So there were crop concerns for some time. Once the harvest started, there was really no reliable crop information. Now, there were different reports, different opinions, but if you wanted to get a good comprehensive picture, it's not there. And there's a whole series of reasons for that. Lack of infrastructure, the level of production being identified as part of national pride, the prestige that goes with increased production, and simply a lack of respect for the impact of the numbers that may be published. So RCN prices started to steady up. No surprise, low levels, forward contracts, concerns on the crop, lack of information. Of course they start to steady up. Then we get the rumors. So we started to get rumors about major problems. It started with Cambodia. Cambodia was going to have a really poor crop, but of course it didn't. It hasn't. And the figures of imports into Vietnam confirm that for us, as do our friends in Cambodia. So first of all, the rumor in Cambodia was wrong. Then we got these huge rumors about West Africa, a lower crop without the context of there was a bumper crop last year. So if you look at the average in Ivory Coast, for example, the average for 5 years is about 970,000 tonnes. People are talking about 1.1 million tonne crop this year. Is that a disaster? No. But is it well down on last year? Well, it is, because last year we had the biggest crop in history. So what you compare the numbers to makes a big difference as to the conclusion you might draw. Processors started to buy. They had forward contracts, there was low prices, the market was steadying up, there were a few rumors around, they started to buy. Makes sense. Kernel buyers started to cover. So we saw Chinese buyers buying, we saw short-term markets where they buy for 2 to 3 months forward, they were buying too. Then comes the ban. So prices had moved up and you get this ban on exports and nobody's really sure what's going on. They know there's rumors about the crop. They know it's a little bit late. Then we get this ban. And of course, what does the ban do? Because it's not defined in time, because it's not clear, at least internationally, what it means, we get more uncertainty, more rumors. Traders mark up the prices. Well, why not? There's nothing to lose. Let's speculate. That's what we do. Processors stopped offering kernels because they could not get this calculation to work. They're already sold at low prices. They can't buy raw cashew nuts now to cover those and make a profit, so they're not going to sell any more to make additional problems for themselves. Of course, kernel prices move up, but they move up on relatively light volumes of trade. And of course, to make matters worse, we now get contracts default on raw cashew nuts. So now you could be a processor who has a low price forward sale. You're nervous about selling further because you don't want to dig the hole any deeper that you're in. And now your suppliers are defaulting on you on the raw cashew nuts that you've already bought. What's next? Logically, defaults on cashew kernels contracts, followed by buying to cover defaults, because whether a processor may default on an importer, and the importer needs to cover then to supply their customer, even if they can't, the customer is unlikely, very unlikely, to default on the supermarket or the brand that they've sold the product to. Further speculation. What will happen? But then what probably is going to happen is the ban in Ivory Coast will come to an end. Demand will stall because you don't go from $2.40 or 50 to $3.20 or 30 and see no impact on demand. There has to be an impact on demand. For some, it'll take time because there will already be commitments. For others, it'll happen right away. Then the crop size will eventually be accepted and established. And our point of view is that it's probably not as low as some of these rumors have suggested. And that's game over. And what's at stake here is essentially the second half of 2024 demand-wise. Questions we need to ask are, first of all, recognizing that the market has surged up more on rumor than on fact. Crops in West Africa are late, but are they actually short? What will Ivory Coast do with its RCN? I don't think they're going to leave it on farms and in warehouses for the rest of the year. I think they will eventually lift the ban. And that leads us to the key question, are the current prices sustainable? Now, if we think about prices, are these prices workable? Have we seen them before? Well, we have. And have they been sustained for long periods in the past? Well, yes, they have. Are they sustainable in the current situation? It seems unlikely, not because the prices themselves or the values themselves are unworkable, but simply because this bubble has happened so quickly. This bubble trouble probably comes to an end. Now, I don't think the market will crash. I don't think the market will go back to where it was. I think prices were always likely to rise in the course of this year. But this last 2 weeks of price rises, I think is going to be very difficult to sustain. Once the fear goes out of it a little bit, and the ban could be the catalyst, or the lifting of the ban could be the catalyst for that, then it probably eases back a little bit. If what we really do have to think about, though, is the impact of defaults. So if we get this chain reaction of defaults, this can sustain the prices more. Now, there's going to be a price to pay for that. There's going to be an impact, and that could be in 2025. So as demand has recovered in 2023, and as the signs were so positive in 2024, this could be brought to a fairly dramatic halt by these sharp increases in prices. And that's the big question that needs to be answered in the next 3 to 4 weeks. And when and if and how the export ban in Ivory Coast is removed will have a significant bearing on how the market sees that trend. So let's have a look at production, segment number 5. And I want to give them a warning to our guests. I'm going to come to you in the course of this segment. I'll give a brief overview on some of the countries, and then first we'll come to Amit Pai and we'll talk about the situation in India, and afterwards we'll talk to John Rao on the situation in the region of Senegal, Guinea-Bissau and the Gambia. So Cambodia, well, not much new to be said. Imports into Vietnam suggest that the crop is a bigger crop than last year, 5 to 10% higher, which by the way was the prediction way back in February from some observers. It looks like they were right. Vietnam crop smaller than last year, no doubt about that. Last calculation showed that inventories were 70-75 days. That's still there. Why? Because the impact of the late shipments and the temporary export ban in Ivory Coast would not yet have been felt, but there is perhaps a shortage emerging later on. So what's happened in 2 weeks is the facts haven't really changed, not in relation to the crop, not in relation to demand, but the way we look at them has. Vietnamese processors, understandably, record imports, but sold positions at low prices and a poor information or a poor understanding of what's happening in Africa. And into that falls the rumors. In India, definitely higher prices change the sentiment naturally. In Africa, for processors, big opportunity. So if there's problems in competitors, there is an opportunity for processors in West Africa with lower priced raw material. There's an opportunity for them to make some nice prices for export and to follow the market up and make some prices that they didn't expect earlier in this year. And certainly all of this conversation has focused more and more people on looking at West Africa as a source of cashew kernels, and they'll be looking at East Africa too as the season develops there from September onwards. This whole situation is influenced by what we spoke about earlier: rumor, myth, lack of good market information, these destabilizing factors. Let's have a look in West Africa. West African production, Nigeria. So we've been looking at crop situation, we've been talking to observers there, and generally speaking, we're getting pretty good numbers in terms of the volume. A really good crop according to many reports. The crop's coming to an end now. Obviously farm gate prices are steady. Ghana, different story. Some really good input from the Tree Crops Development Authority during the week, and generally speaking, people's estimates of the crop are down. There is some late flowering, interestingly. Someone was telling me, someone who's well informed was telling me there's some late flowering, and that may improve the situation. And of course, as you'd expect, large volumes flowing in from Ivory Coast with the export ban in place there. Benin, we hear estimates, wide range of estimates from 140,000 tonnes up as high as 200,000 tonnes. Difficult to get a number. It's difficult to get a number because the cross-border trade, due to the export ban, has really ratcheted up. So it's mostly going to Togo, but also into Nigeria, where it may be exported or it may be processed. And processors, as a result, struggling to source. So you would have thought an export ban would lead to low farm gate prices, easy for processors to get what they want. It hasn't. And this is a bit of a shock. And it hasn't been a great series of events for the industry in Benin. Burkina, I don't have much additional to add. I think that the crop there is well down, as we said 2 weeks ago, and therefore the supply of raw cashew nuts is limited, maybe very limited. Processors would struggle. Exporters will probably send less for export this year than last year. Ivory Coast, just to reiterate, crop arrivals continue. Some processors are buying. Farm gate prices, that figure is actually a little bit low. That the CFA price is anywhere from 250 CFA to 350 at the moment. We saw those numbers earlier. Crop estimates, depending on who you talk to, but most people are in or around 1 million tonnes. Well down on last year, but slightly above the 5-year average. So generally speaking, looking at the harvests in West Africa, mixed picture, definitely lower quality, better in some places than in others. So let's go and talk to our guests. So we're going to come first of all to Amit Pai, the managing partner of Amit Agro, and I'm going to ask him to chat to us a little bit about the situation in India and how that's developed over the last couple of weeks. Amit was with us earlier in the year and he was able to give us some information on the early season events in India. So let me just get my screens right. I hope that's still working with you. Amit, how are you?
Hi Jim, great to be here back.
All good, I hope?
Oh yes, all good. The monsoons have started and we saw a blockbuster yesterday. So
All right, well, I hope all continues good for India.
yeah.
Last time we talked about, you were saying it was a little bit earlier for the Indian crop. That's going back somewhat 3-4 weeks now. What's the outlook now? Is the crop coming in as hoped for?
Well, maybe not, Jim. We are definitely seeing a drop in the estimated levels of production. In areas, well, the shortage is more pronounced in the eastern part of India as compared to the western coast. In areas of Maharashtra, in the Ghat areas of Maharashtra, we've reported a 5 or 10% higher crop than last year. But
Oh,
overall, we are seeing a drop compared to the previous years. What's a great news that has come out this year is that in non-conventional and non-traditional areas of India, we are seeing a good crop come out. These are the plantations that have taken root maybe 3-4 years ago in places like northwest, northeastern part of Karnataka, the drier areas of India. We're seeing a good crop come in. So I think that is some ray of hope for the Indian production at large over a longer period of time. Uh, as regards to the rains and the showers that we saw in first week, second week of April, maybe they were not sufficient enough to change the pattern of the crop in India. So overall, we can say a short crop year in India for sure.
okay. Okay. Now, it's interesting though with new areas coming online because we have seen for a long period, we have not seen fast growth in Indian cashew production. are we going to see in the coming years, are we going to see this? Yeah, I think it's been below 2% over the years as the average growth. Are we going to see that accelerate?
Maybe not to the tune of the African nations, but
Mm,
we are seeing a lot of new areas come up with these plantations. Especially if you talk of the country as a whole, we can see a lot of plantations that have come up in the northeastern part of India. Now, this was totally something that was never planting cashew, but that crop is now coming into India. So I think over a period of the next 10-15 years, we can see some growth coming in.
that's good news, I think. It's good news for India, but you know, a high reliance on imports at the moment. What about quality? In the African countries this year, we've seen quite a variation in quality. We've seen some lower quality in some countries. Is the same thing being experienced in India?
Uh, No, contrary to what we are seeing in the global crop, Indian crop has been fairly good on quality, bearing a few coastal Maharashtrian crop where we had, infestation issues right in the raw cashew nuts. Bearing
Mm,
that, there has been no significant drop in quality all across the Indian crop. I can say that to a certain extent the weather prompted a good quality for us. The prolonged dry spell in December and the flowering months have given have resulted in very good color in most of the areas in India. We can say that in the coastal areas we've had nut counts from 160 to 185, and up the ghats we've had 180 to 210 nut count, with the outturn being 50 to 54 pounds throughout.
wow, okay. So no quality issues in India.
No.
And what about this we've been talking about the ban, the temporary ban on exports from Ivory Coast. Has that had any impact in India so far?
Um, okay, for this, what if you analyze the market, we slightly go back maybe a month before the ban. What we saw was all the origins were dropping the prices, whereas IVC was holding it steady at around 1050 to 1075 levels.
Hmm.
So at that point, what happened was a large chunk of Indian processors, forward traders, took position in other origins and put IVC aside because the prices in IVC were not dropping. And you were getting Togo, Burkina Faso, Nigeria at relatively lower prices. So it turned out to be a blessing in disguise because Indian exposure to Ivory Coast dropped, drastically as compared to last year. So other than the crazy price rise that the ban has prompted and a few contract renegotiations or cancellations,
Hmm.
not a significant impact of the ban on Indian imports, if you ask me. uh, but more importantly, uh, what it did was, India or our associations, the Karnataka State Association, has very good relationships with CCA. So maybe this ban could have been a bit more well handled by taking all of us into confidence also. Of course, the first priority was securing nuts for the Ivorian processors. But a note or a word of confidence to all the other buyers would have definitely helped in easing out the issues that the ban could have possibly caused.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I think it's a very valid point too. Um, but it would appear then that in India you're not seeing the kind of impacts that Vietnam is seeing in terms of contract default and renegotiation.
Not much. Again, harping back on the previous point, since we had a lower exposure, we don't see much of default coming in here. But what we're seeing is a lot of delays, because a lot of 46 and 47 pound cargo was traded from IVC, which were all May and June shipments. They are getting delayed now, but most of them are not getting renegotiated. Plus, the part of the country that we belong to, normally, ups or downs, the factory owners normally honor their contracts, and I think we are getting a reciprocal, what do you call, a reciprocal behavior from our sellers on this. Not much of defaults or renegotiations we are seeing in India.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, and that is always obviously always an issue with in these situations, the kind of tit for tat defaults. You know, one season I default on you, the other season you default on me, and so on. Um, if that trend is broken, then that's obviously good news. Um, but what about in terms of, we have heard over the last few years that life has been difficult for Indian cashew processors. It's been difficult to operate profitably. Maybe last year was a bit better. Um, have the current changes in price, have they created a problem again in terms of imported RCN prices compared to the domestic kernels market?
Um, Actually not, Jim. So this is one of these few years where we can say key processing is viable at any price rise. Of course, Ronet is running at a faster pace than the kernels. The kernels are still playing catch up. But by the time you get the high priced nuts to your factory and process, the kernels would have eventually caught up with the price rise. Actually, what is we are observing another thing here is that people have already bought Ronets also are preferring to sell it off and encash their profits than process it and then sell it at a later date. So
Yeah.
this is one thing that we are seeing in India. Processing volume even today is at around 50 to 60% of our installed capacity, which means that there is already a short supply situation in India, and that is giving enough of buoyancy to the kernel prices. Also, what we've seen is this short supply is primarily caused because of shipping issues. We are seeing a lot of containers bound to India getting held up at Colombo or Singapore or even in Indian ports. For the first time, some cargo that I was supposed to receive is sitting in Mumbai port. That is something that has never happened. There are some cargoes that are sitting in Tuticorin port, which is supposed to reach Mangalore. So this shipping issues, the logistics issues are causing a larger, are adding larger fuel to the fire than actually the Ivorian ban or the news of shortage.
That is interesting, and that's something that's obviously going to continue for some time. These things tend not to get sorted out very quickly.
Of course, if we were processing as much as we did last year, Jim, we wouldn't have been seeing these kernel prices in India for sure. It would have been way lower than what it is today.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, how has demand been for kernels in India this year?
It's again more of a FOMO demand. Everybody is buying at whatever prices you're offering. Supply constraints are what is hitting the demand. India has built a large supply base on low priced kernels because there was abundance of kernels available in the market and unhindered supplies. You can ask for 100 tons of 320, you would get it in India mostly. So now what is happening is this supply is becoming slightly erratic and fluctuating. This can cause a drop in demand. Otherwise, the prices will not have such a huge impact on the demand as compared to the erratic and the irrational supplies that we are seeing now. We have seen a 20 to 25% hike in Indian kernel prices. That's in line with what you just showed on your international graph.
Yeah.
Anything beyond this, anything significantly beyond this is again going to add to a long-term demand. But definitely. One more very interesting thing is I think this year India will export more compared to demand for Indian kernels globally. That is slightly contrasting whatever we have discussed because the prices are going up. Still, you're seeing a lot of demand in the global market for Indian nuts. Vietnam is also showing higher export figures. So somewhere I think the market has grown, maybe possible.
I think maybe that there is a increasing demand for high quality kernels from India.
Spot demand, high quality kernels, or however we can put that.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. Okay, so in summary, we're looking at a lower Indian crop than hoped for. That's
Yes.
not it's not uniform across the country. interestingly, for the long term, we're seeing an increase in new plantations, particularly in the northeast. Northeast Karnataka, for example, drier areas where, and this might lead to a more sustained increase in production in India over the longer term. That's interesting. Demand is good. Quality is good, from what you're saying, Amit. And perhaps the impact of the Ivorian ban has not really been felt in India in the way it's been felt in Vietnam. It just underlines how different the two processing giants are from each other, yet again for us. I mean, it's really interesting, and there's bound to be some interesting questions and comments, but for the moment, thank you very much for that very clear, concise impression of the situation in India.
Thank you.
Well, let's move to a different part of the world, and we're going to go back to West Africa, and we're going to go back to the area that's harvesting now, and which is the most westerly cashew growing countries on the continent of Africa, and to John Rao. John has been with us before. John, you're very welcome. How are you?
Morning, Jim. How are you?
All is good, thanks very much. We're in interesting times, I
Oh,
think.
yes.
One uses the word interesting in different ways, but anyway. I know you're busy shuttling between Ziguinchor and Bissau. Are you getting a chance to observe the harvests, and how are the crops looking in the region?
It's very interesting, Jim. A month ago, we've done a bit of a tour in the interior of Senegal and in the interior of Bissau. And contrary to what was being said, we found quite a lot of fruits, quite a lot of fruiting, quite a lot of flowering, and no major winds. So we thought the crop should be normal. And as the season has progressed, yes, there's been a lot of drying out of the flowers, and arrivals have been sporadic, but we're still not able to establish, is that because the farmers are still holding the nuts because they see prices rising almost every 2 days? Or is it really a short crop?
What about arrivals, John? I mean, if we look at arrivals into Ziguinchor and into Bissau, are we getting any indication of those compared to last year or previous years?
I think it's going to be a very interesting situation here. Last year, for example, the border was like the Wild West. I mean, you actually
Yes.
you actually had traffic jams of trucks in Ziguinchor,
Yes.
of cargo laden from Bissau, and the normal smuggling or the normal informal export, as we like to call it, is around 40 to 50,000 tons into Ziguinchor. Local crop, we estimate around 45 to 50,000 tons. I know you had said 60,000 tons. Maybe it's up to 60 also. And so this is the normal situation in Senegal. Last year, we assumed the infiltration or the exfiltration was over 100,000 tons. And this is blown out by the figures. I mean, Ziguinchor recorded about 155,000 tons moving out of Ziguinchor to the port of Dakar. And correspondingly, from Guinea-Bissau, where we had no indications of any major crop failures in any of the 5 regions, we exported only about 190,000 tons against a normal quantity of 235,000 tons. So our assumption is a lot of that quantity went across the border. Now, this has had 2 interesting effects. In Senegal, normally you have about 60 operators exporting from here. That's jumped to about 170 this year. So everybody thought, like you said, probably misinterpreted the figures, felt that Senegal is the new El Dorado. And so you have 160, 170 players in this year. And guess what? For a change, the government of Bissau has really tightened the border. And so you don't have a lot of nuts crossing the border. So you've got a lot of these warehouses, and you have very interesting scenes of Indians running behind literally every truck, fighting with each other, outbidding each other by 3, 4, 5 CFR. and trying to get cargo into their warehouses. And
So just to make that, you've got more than twice the number of traders chasing less cargo.
absolutely.
So you're going to get, obviously, you're going to get price inflation in that situation.
As of yesterday, the price in Ziegler was 840 CFR. This is
Good
like
Lord.
60 to 70% higher than last year. And it's a corresponding situation in Guinea-Bissau too, but there are different factors for that. I mean, last year, the highest price in Guinea-Bissau was about 300 CFR. I'm talking about ex-weighbridge price in Bissau. And most of the time, it was in the range of 250 to 275 CFR. And this year, the price has already crossed 640 CFR. And this means the same amount of capital is going to buy less than half the quantity this year. And but there has been a corresponding change in selling prices, especially in the
Yeah.
past 2 weeks. I mean, we exporters are usually, the 2022 experience was a major character-defining experience for a lot of us. I mean, we we actually had to go down to India, a lot of us, clear our goods, store them in warehouses, and literally sell them truck by truck, with people coming in and pointing fingers at different lots and saying, okay, maybe this, maybe that. Well, the wheel of fortune, the wheel of time has turned. And this year, especially in the past 2 weeks, we have inquiries almost every day. And yeah, for the moment, it's a nice feeling. Is the market going to crash in the next 2 weeks? And are we going to go running back to India to clear locally and sell our cargo? Open question. But coming back to Bissau, I'd like to make a point. Given the fact that so much quantity was smuggled across the border last year, I don't expect the local export from Bissau to go down this year. In fact, I expect it to go up to maybe about 200,000 tons, even if there is a short crop of maybe 10%. I don't think the short crop is going to be more than 10 to 15%, if there is a short crop.
Okay, I mean that's really interesting. So I mean, there has been, I know that the government in Bissau introduced changes to the system that would enhance the shipments through Bissau and maybe make it less attractive to export through Senegal. And I know that the government made statements about enforcement on the border. That's worked by the sounds of it.
Oh, yes. Up to now, definitely the enforcement of the border has had an effect. And this is very important because the duty and the freight rates from Bissau are exceptionally high, especially in comparison to Senegal. So if I was a farmer in one of the border areas, it's definitely very attractive for me to, load up 2 or 3 bags on my little motorcycle or on my donkey or on my bicycle and cross the border, try to cross the border because I'm going to make at least 100 CFR more. And that's a huge incentive for a farmer. And of course, the government of Guinea-Bissau relies mainly on tax revenues from cashew. So they are not in a position to really reduce taxes too much. Definitely not to the level of Senegal, where you have practically zero duty. And the freight rates, that is something that can be looked into, but that's a different topic altogether. I mean, just for a comparison, the freight rate from Senegal is about $22 right now. And the same thing is about $190 from Guinea-Bissau this year. It's amazing, the difference in freight rates.
Ooh, that is amazing.
Per ton, yeah.
Wow.
And coming to what the government has done this year, yes, indeed, 2 or 3 very positive steps. Number one, they reduced some of the taxes, realigned some of the taxes, and mainly they reduced the reference price for calculating duties. So last year it was $900. That makes a difference. It reduced overall cost over $25, and which may not sound very big in bigger picture, but every year was just raising taxes on cash, it actually made an effort to reduce taxes, which is a very welcome change in thinking. And more than that, they opened the season early. You may recall last year, the Albaras, that is the export license, were given sometime in June. This year they actually opened the season in March, and I've started getting Alvarez sometime in May. And the first bulk vessel is already loaded and left. The second bulk vessel is loading right now. The first container vessel, CMA CGM, I think left yesterday. And MSC vessel is due in the next few days. So yes, indeed, the government has been very proactive on this, and of course, controlling the border. Like I told you, no matter what steps are taken within the country, there will always be the incentive to smuggle the goods across the border because there is always going to be this at least 100 to 150, 170 CFR difference in prices to the farmer. And so you will need a bit of strict enforcement also to this flow. So I think the government's been active on all these three fronts.
Well, it's nice to get a more optimistic outlook from Guinea-Bissau, particularly given some of the events of recent years. So it sounds as if that the crop may be a little bit lower, but not more than 10%. It sounds as if there'll be more exports through Bissau port, through the legitimate channels this year. That there is a bit of what I call the demand pull, price inflation, too many people tracing too little product in Senegal. Your quality is good. You're open for business and you're receiving inquiries every day.
Oh,
is that a fair summary?
We're in cashew paradise right now.
Well, I'm glad somebody is.
A couple of points to add to what you said. Quality indeed is good or even better than last year. And this is mainly because last year, a lot of the cashew was stored in very congested conditions at the farm levels for a long period of time before it was allowed to move into Bissau. This year, it's been the opposite. I mean, goods have started flowing pretty early into warehouses in Bissau. Right now, we think more than half the crop, I think more than 100,000 tons has already come into Bissau. And we're only, starting June. And so this is a very positive sign. A lot of our processors who came and visited us commented that the color is much better on the kernels this year. Out turns 53 or more. Very rarely do we get less than 53 pounds. Nut count around 220 or lower. And so, yes, indeed, the quality is pretty good in Bissau this year. And a couple of other points to be added. You see, Bissau is the last game in town for the northern cycle. And a lot of people who had not covered quantities in the other origins or who were waiting for lower prices and things like that, I mean, they find that now this is the last stop. And so they've come in here, especially a lot of processors from Amit's hometown, Mangalore, who've been buying very aggressively in Bissau this year. And Vietnam normally does not buy a lot of Bissau crop because it's higher priced. But in the past 2 weeks, we've seen a few people buying from Vietnam very strongly and actually pushing up the prices. And so, yes, that is the competitive scenario out here right now.
John, that's terrific. Thank you very much for that input. I'm sure people will really value having a better understanding of the situation and maybe away from some of the rumors that have been knocking around. I even heard a rumor yesterday that someone said exports of cashew from Guinea-Bissau would be banned. That is the most ridiculous rumor I think we could hear. But that was said by someone yesterday.
I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Please go ahead, John.
That's just rumor number one. Rumor number two was that 18% of the crop is going to be reserved for local production. And of course, the questions in our minds were why 18%? Why not 20? Why not 15? And who exactly is going to do this processing? I mean,
maybe they have a lot of units on paper very quickly.
We have a lot of units on paper, but the functional ones are only about 3 in terms of significant volume. So there is no way that these things are going to happen. I don't think the government's even contemplating this.
No, it would be a ridiculous misstep in terms of policy were they to do so.
The comment you made, the head of the program, is very true, Jim. We buy on rumor, and then we buy on rumor and we sell on facts. And I mean, every evening especially for a lot of some of us get together. And of course, the topic of conversation is, are we heading down the same path? And so you've got the doomsayers who are saying this is exactly going to be a repeat of 2022. This is a bubble that's going to crash, and we're all going to be left holding the baby. And then there are the very optimistic types who say that there are differences between 22 and this year. For starters, they say that India normally got, and in 2022, a lot of goods that were destined for Vietnam ended up being diverted to India. So we ended up with a supply situation that was about 3 to 4 than what India normally takes. And that's what caused a huge mismatch between supply and demand. They say this year that's not so. As Amit pointed out, the Indian crop itself, but I think we have better statistics. I mean, the Indian crop does seem to be a bit short, 10, 15%, I don't know. Earlier estimates were 25%, but I think that's been revised downwards now.
Yeah, I
10
think
to
so.
10%. And so they say we may not be going down the same path. And most importantly, kernel prices have picked up. Amit's happy, I'm happy. The Vietnamese are happy. People who don't normally buy such high price crops have started coming in and, stocking up. So yes, happy times.
Thank you, John. Okay, let's John, stay with us. There's going to be some questions. Amit, I hope you're still with us, and there will be a few questions when we finish. I'm going to have a very quick review of supply and demand just to see what some of these things mean. So here is a history of cashew production and a couple of estimates. I do a low estimate, high estimate for 2024. And this is based on what we're hearing from the various countries, which would mean that on the high estimate, the optimistic side, which probably is unlikely at this point, we will be looking at a crop similar to 2022 in volume, though not a scenario, to John's point, not a scenario similar to 2022. On the lower end, we would be looking at a crop that's significantly below 2022. So I think that's a better comparison than when we look at last year, because last year was definitely a bumper crop. Now, if we look at on our figures, and this is taking figures from all different places, based on what we know now, and we've been a little bit more conservative on the Indian crop than we've just heard, so this might need a slight revision. Our calculation would say world crop down by about 8%. It's different to the INC estimate, which was publicized a lot during the INC conference a few weeks ago, and there's various reasons for that. The Cambodian situation, Nigeria, Guinea, the figures in Benin, I doubt it, but you can have a look at those if you're interested, or you can contact me if you're interested in the reasons for the differences. What's changed since the last time we were together, we've marked the Indian crop down by 8% based on weather reports. Now from Amit, I might be increasing that significantly. So it might be down by more than that from what we've heard. We've increased the estimate from Cambodia. We've increased by 50,000 tons at the moment, and that's purely based on import statistics. That figure could get bigger. Nigeria, we have marked down slightly, even though the crop estimates remain optimistic. Guinea-Bissau, again, maybe conservative. We marked it down by about 7.5%. So John is saying could be 10 at worst, but he has put the big little word, if there is a shortage. So he's more optimistic on the crop than perhaps we've been. We have increased the Indonesian crop a little, and we've left the estimate for Cote d'Ivoire at 1.1 million tons, which I think when it's all counted, that's where we will be. What would that mean for supply and demand? So it would mean that we are coming out of a period of significant surpluses, but probably only temporarily. So we had a significant surpluses in 21, 22, even in 2023 when demand was very strong. The overall supply, including a carry-in, so bearing in mind there was significant carry-in year to year, going back to some famous trading events, but also simply more production, growth in production in West Africa 2022, 23, and growth in production in Cambodia in 2021. So the grey versus the orange would be the calculated surplus. Now it's not as big as it looks, because obviously you have to have a carry out, because otherwise you've nothing to do in the month of January, you've nothing to process. But essentially a period of surpluses. And based on the initial expectations of 2024, we would have expected, again, a lower surplus, because we were expecting production to be a little bit lower, but we were also expecting demand to be quite strong again. However, if we now project that and look at some of the information that's been gathered since the beginning of the harvest, if we plug in a 15% decline in world production, so that ranges across a wide range of countries, significant drop in Côte d'Ivoire, lesser drop in other West African countries, an increase in Cambodia, significant drop in Vietnam and in India, you get a situation this year where you could see supply and demand closely matched. Now, demand calculation there is based on the 5-year average, right? 3.2%, and we mark that down significantly down to 2% demand growth this year, and that would give us a near enough balanced situation. If production was only down by 10%, you would have a situation where it's not a huge surplus, but it is a surplus. So the question is there, if we were to ask the question, is there a major shortage of cashews in the world foreseen in 2024? No. Prices have gone up, and rightly so, because they were significantly lower than they should ever have been. This is going to have an impact on demand, particularly in price-sensitive markets. So it might impact demand from China, which has been particularly strong in the first quarter of this year. It could have an impact in the United States, where demand, after a poor 2022 and a poor start to 2023, demand had responded to lower prices. It may well respond the other way. And just to have a look at those prices then, here's our price trend and our supply-demand balance. So we have the situation, 2021 prices peaked on strong demand growth during COVID, and although we had a good crop, getting that crop to market was challenging in the midst of COVID. Following that, a carry-in, surplus, prices fell, never justified really. I mean, if we think about it, the crash of prices of cashew kernels to below $2.40 FOB for 320s could never have been justified on the supply and demand balance. And the crash in, for example, Côte d'Ivoire RCN prices below $1,000 a ton cost and freight, this could never have been justified either. The key calculation, of course, in all of this is not the absolute level of prices, it's the relationship between RCN price and kernels price, and whether that's sustainable and whether that impacts consumer demand. So this year we would have expected a rise in price. We've seen a sharp rise in price. My guess is prices 320s, 35, 310, 320 is sustainable. Beyond that is probably not sustainable in the international market. It will slip back, but I'm not sure that that will impact particularly high quality raw cashew nuts will be in demand. We might see a retracement on pricing on lower quality material. So some key points before we move on to some questions from Ernest. Key points from my perspective would be, first of all, the market has moved up primarily on rumour, really based on what might be, not what is. Based on reports, it's clear. The 2024 crop is not as good as the 2023 crop, but the rumour and the chat has definitely exaggerated the crop problem. The Ivory Coast ban could cause a temporary technical shortage in Vietnam later, but it's not going to be in any way critical, in the sense that there have been successful exports from other countries. Exports so far this year are well ahead of last year. What will happen to the raw cashew nuts held in Ivory Coast? Ask me, I'll tell you they're going to get exported, the ban will be lifted, trade will return. Prices, as we've said, were always likely to move up. Maybe they've gone a little bit far on kernels, more on kernels than RCN. Time will tell. The one risk I would be concerned about, or one of the key risks, and this particularly applies to cashew kernels, is that defaults of contract could ignite a speculative price bubble. And that could be very destructive for demand. It could happen, well, it could happen anytime, but it's more likely to happen in the next 4 weeks. If it doesn't happen, then it probably won't happen at all. So that's something to watch out for. But that's more or less related to a created technical shortage by default of contract. And if we get this chain of defaults, particularly if Vietnamese processors are defaulted on and some of them in turn default, that could be really bad news for demand. And finally, I would say on what we know, on what we've heard, and again, thanks to our two guests, Amit Pai from India and John Rao talking about Guinea-Bissau and Senegal, the surplus is likely to return next year. And we may well be regretting some of the things that happened this year, 12 months from now. So let me return you to Ernest and see if there are any questions or comments from everyone online. Ernest.
Hi, Jim. Thanks so much for the session. And thanks to Amit and also John. It's a pleasure having you on this program. And I'll start with the first question, but let me start with John, because we are concluding on that. I think people are getting jittery anytime they hear of a ban. And the question is that given the dynamics of your region, what